On her birthday, with the whole family gathered and the table heavy with food and flowers, my daughter raised her glass and said with a cruel laugh, "Dad, you have no taste. Everything you touch is outdated, ugly." The words landed like stones in my chest. The room erupted with small chuckles, friends exchanging glances, even her husband smirking as though it were a harmless joke. But I knew the difference between laughter and mockery. This was no slip of the tongue. It was a wound delivered in public, sharpened by the pride in her voice. I sat quietly, pretending to sip my water, though the taste had turned bitter. My hand trembled slightly, not from age but from restraint. She didn't even look at me as she continued, turning her head toward her guests, flaunting the confidence of someone who believed her judgment was flawless. She spoke of the new house she dreamed of, with soaring ceilings and glass walls, the epitome of good taste, as if my silence were proof of her superiority. Her words circled the table like knives. He doesn't understand style. He doesn't even know what elegance looks like. Every eye slid to me in that moment, measuring my reaction, waiting for me to defend myself. But I did not. I had learned long ago that silence can be heavier than words, and that sometimes dignity must dress itself in quiet. Still, inside me, the sting spread deep, deeper than her careless laughter could ever guess. She was my daughter, flesh of my flesh, yet she had stripped me of worth in front of strangers, as if I were a relic too dusty to matter. I remembered the long nights when I sacrificed for her schooling, the mornings when my hands bled from work so she could wear the latest clothes, the days when every coin I saved went not into my comfort, but into her future. And now that future stood before me, mocking the very foundation it was built upon. She looked at me not as a father, but as a man to be dismissed, a man who no longer had a place in the modern world she adored. I smiled faintly, though my heart bled, and raised my glass in silence. They saw a man too tired to respond, too humble to strike back, but what they could not see, what she could not see, was that every insult had awakened something inside me. She had called me tasteless, a man with no vision, no refinement. Yet sitting in front of her was proof she did not know her own story, her own house of dreams, her own father's truth, and one day soon she would discover that the taste she worshipped had always been mine. Friends, let me pause for a moment. Please write in the comments, where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. That's how you help us grow this channel. And now, we continue. He smiled faintly, as if her words had not struck him. But behind that small curve of his lips there was a silence burning so deep it could have scorched the air. He sat there, still, his eyes lowered, pretending to focus on the flicker of candlelight. Yet every word she had spoken clung to him like a thorn pressed into flesh. For years he had let her believe what she wanted to believe, that he was simple, unrefined, a man whose world was built on necessity rather than beauty. He had never corrected her when she waved her manicured hand dismissively at his clothes, his furniture, his way of living. He thought, perhaps, that letting her think she was above him would give her wings, would free her from the weight of his humble life. But that night, her cruelty cut deeper than before, because it was not whispered in the privacy of their home, not tossed carelessly in a moment of impatience. It was spoken with pride, in front of a table filled with eyes and ears ready to measure him against her mockery. He remembered all the years he had swallowed his pride for her sake, working quietly while others took the spotlight, saving money where none could be spared, all so she would never feel small among her peers. He remembered the countless sacrifices that never made it into words, the nights he came home weary and unrecognized, content only with the thought that she would one day look back and see not a tasteless man, but a father who had given her the very foundation she stood upon. Yet here she was, bold in her disdain, stripping him of dignity with a smile as if it were nothing, as if the years of his life were just clutter she could sweep away with one cruel sentence. He wanted to believe she did not understand the weight of what she had done, that her words were born of youth and arrogance, not true contempt. But as the laughter lingered around the table, as she leaned closer to her friends with a smug pride that his silence only seemed to confirm, he felt something inside him begin to harden. Not anger, not yet, but the slow settling of a truth he could no longer ignore. She did not see him, not truly. She had built a wall between them, crafted from illusions of taste and status, and with every passing year, that wall grew taller, until now she looked down at him as though he were no more than a relic, a shadow to be dismissed. Yet beneath the surface he carried something she could not imagine. He carried memories of lines drawn in midnight solitude, of shapes taking form beneath his pencil, of buildings that had risen from his dreams into reality. He carried a past she had chosen to forget, or perhaps never knew, because he had buried it so deeply to raise her higher. And though her words pierced him like thorns that night, though they burned like fire in his chest, he sat in stillness, knowing that the truth of who he was could not be erased by laughter. One day, when the veil she had wrapped around herself tore away, she would see him not as the man she mocked, but as the man whose vision had quietly shaped the world she longed to belong to. She spoke of her dream home as though it were a crown she was destined to wear. Catalogs lay scattered across the table, pages glistening with photographs of polished marble, glass walls, and furniture so sleek it seemed untouchable. She leaned over them with a reverence she had never once shown for the quiet walls that had sheltered her childhood, the rooms her father had kept warm even when money was thin, the house where every corner bore the weight of sacrifice. Those memories to her were nothing more than a faded past. Now, she wanted her future to shine like the covers of those glossy magazines. She pointed out details to her friends with excitement, her voice rising in triumph as though she herself had drawn the lines, shaped the spaces, created the beauty. When her father offered a thought, softly, humbly, almost as if asking permission, she brushed it aside before it could even take form. "Dad, leave this to people with taste," she said once, her tone sharp, not with rage, but with the confidence of someone who truly believed her words were truth. The others chuckled, nodding with her, as if the verdict had already been sealed. He was the man of the past. She was the woman of the future. He sat quietly, listening, his hands folded on his lap, his face still but his heart restless. She did not know, how could she, that every line she admired, every bold design she worshipped, carried an echo of his own past work. She did not realize that the images she adored were reflections of a language he once spoke fluently, a language of shapes and spaces he had mastered long before her life even began. Yet she looked at him with pity, masked as superiority, the kind of gaze children often cast upon their parents when they believe they have surpassed them. To her, he was an obstacle to style, a reminder of modesty she wanted to escape. To him, she was still the little girl who once drew houses with crooked crayons and begged him to show her how windows and doors were supposed to fit. He had shown her then, smiling as she leaned close, eyes bright with curiosity. But that memory, too, she had cast aside, rewriting her story without him in it. As she spoke of architects with famous names and furniture flown in from distant cities, he felt the sting of being invisible in her world, as though his existence held no part in her future. But deep within, where silence carried weight heavier than words, something stirred. He knew a truth she had yet to face, a truth that would one day bring her laughter to a halt and turn her pride into ashes. For the very house she dreamed of, the one she thought would prove her superiority, was not a stranger's vision at all. It was his. That night, when the house was finally quiet, and her laughter no longer echoed in his ears, he sat alone in his room, the shadows pressing close around him. The warmth of the evening was gone. In its place lingered the sharp chill of her words, and with it a weight he could no longer bear. Slowly, with the heaviness of a man who knows he is about to reopen a wound that never truly healed, he reached for the bottom drawer of his old wooden desk. Its handle creaked in protest, as though it too remembered how long it had been since it was last touched. Inside lay pieces of a life she had no idea existed. Faded photographs, curled at the edges, showing buildings in their first light, their shapes proud against the sky. Architectural sketches, delicate lines drawn by his own hand, lines that once carried the ambition of youth and the fire of possibility. Letters written in ink, their words praising his vision, congratulating him for designs that had not only stood but endured. He lifted each one carefully, as though the paper itself could crumble at the weight of his touch. He stared at one photograph in particular, the image of a house standing bold and timeless, a house he had poured his heart into, each curve and corner carrying his soul. He remembered the nights spent bent over his drafting table, tracing the lines again and again until they spoke to him, until they whispered that they were ready to become stone and wood. That house still stood somewhere in the city, admired by strangers who would never know his name, lived in by families who would never know the man who gave them walls strong enough to hold their dreams. As he turned the pages of an old sketchbook, he felt the ache of time pressing into his chest. He had set this life aside, buried it when family needs grew heavier than ambition, when the sacrifices of fatherhood demanded silence over recognition. He had walked away willingly, believing that what mattered most was not his own glory, but the future of those he loved. And yet, in doing so, he had become invisible, even to his own daughter, erased from the very world he had once helped to shape. The silence of the room seemed to grow louder as he touched the brittle paper, as though the ghosts of his past leaned close to remind him of who he was. He realized then that his daughter's words had not only wounded him, they had awakened something long asleep. The man she mocked as tasteless had once been called visionary. The father she dismissed had once carried entire buildings in his mind before they ever touched the earth. She did not know this. She had never cared to ask, but the evidence of his truth lay there in his hands, undeniable, unerasable. Years ago, before the weight of duty pressed his shoulders down, he had lived another life, a life his daughter had never cared to uncover. Back then, his hands were not just worn from labor, but alive with creation, moving across endless sheets of paper with a precision born of vision. He drew lines that became walls, arcs that became windows of light, foundations that would outlast storms and generations. His work carried a language of its own, silent yet powerful, admired by those who knew how to see. He remembered walking into rooms filled with peers, men and women whose opinions shaped the future of architecture, and hearing his name spoken in the soft, respectful tones reserved for those who had left a mark. But life had other plans. He had not stepped away because he lacked talent, nor because his imagination had run dry. He had stepped away for responsibility, for love, for the kind of sacrifice that is too easily forgotten. When his wife's health faltered, when the weight of bills grew heavier than accolades, he chose to lay down the pen that had been his weapon and take up the burden of survival instead. The world never stopped building without him, but he stopped for the sake of family, for the sake of the little girl who now laughed at his supposed lack of taste. He recalled those quiet nights when he still sketched in the dim light after work, not for fame, but to keep the fire in him alive. He had drawers full of ideas that would never rise into stone, dreams buried beneath the soil of necessity. Yet a few of his creations had broken free, had been built, had stood proudly in the world without his name shining above them. They belonged to the people who lived in them, who admired them, never knowing the man behind the design walked past them as a stranger. The bitter truth was that his daughter now admired those same circles that had once whispered his name, those architects whose work she studied, those magazines that praised designs he had once helped inspire. She spoke of them with reverence, quoting their styles, praising their genius, never realizing that her own father had once walked among them, not as an outsider, but as one of their own. And so he kept his silence, allowing her pride to grow unchecked, carrying the quiet burden of a man erased by his own sacrifice. But as he sat now with the old sketches in his lap, he felt the past stirring again. He was not tasteless. He was not a relic. He had been an artist whose work had touched lives, whose vision had shaped spaces people called home. And though his daughter's words tried to strip him of dignity, the truth of his past stood stronger than her ignorance. One day, he knew, that truth would rise again, not for revenge, but for justice, for the simple dignity of a life that had never deserved to be dismissed. Now, his own daughter had erased him with one careless sentence. No taste, no worth. The man who had carried her on his shoulders, who had bent his back so she could stand taller, had been reduced to a punchline at her table. All the sacrifices that had once been invisible, he had accepted that. All the hours of sleepless work, the missed opportunities, the career left behind, he had buried them quietly in the soil of responsibility. But this dismissal, spoken with laughter, was different. It was not silence that swallowed him this time. It was erasure. She had taken the life of a man and stripped it of meaning with nothing more than a smirk. He remembered the nights he walked home in the rain, pockets nearly empty, holding groceries for her favorite meals. He remembered the heavy choice of leaving behind projects that could have carried his name into history, because her future weighed heavier than his ambition. And yet, none of it remained in her memory. To her, he was just a man in the corner, too outdated to advise, too plain to be respected. She did not even see the contradiction, that the very roof above her head had been held up by his silent labor, that her path to taste and elegance had been paved by his unseen sacrifices. The pain was not only in what she said, but in what it revealed, that she had never truly known him, never cared to ask about the man behind the father. In her eyes he was fixed, static, unchanging, a man of old shoes and simple meals, of plain furniture and modest choices. She could not see that behind those choices had always been vision, restraint, and sacrifice. She could not see that her father's silence was not emptiness, but the echo of a life deliberately given away so hers could flourish. As he sat with her words echoing in his ears, the wound deepened. Not because he needed her admiration, but because she could so easily dismiss his existence as worthless. To be unseen by strangers was nothing. To be forgotten by history was bearable. But to be erased by his own daughter, this was cruelty heavier than any insult. The father she mocked was the same man who had kept her safe, the same man who had built the very soil under her feet. He closed his eyes and let the ache spread through him, not as anger, but as grief. He did not want revenge. He did not want to strike back. But he felt the undeniable truth that one day, whether she sought it or not, she would face the weight of her words. Because legacies cannot be erased, not with laughter, not with mockery. They endure, waiting for the moment when truth finally breaks through blindness. The house rose in his memory like a cathedral, not of stone but of light. Years ago, when his hand was steady and his vision untamed, he had drawn its first breath in graphite lines across a blank page. The newspapers had once called it a masterpiece of modern warmth, a building that held both elegance and humanity, that welcomed the sun in through its tall windows and cradled families within walls that seemed to breathe. People marveled at its balance, the clean lines softened by gentle curves, the strength of its structure tempered by a quiet intimacy. It had been his design. His heart poured into beams and angles, his sleepless nights translated into walls that still stood proud against the sky. He remembered the first time he walked through its finished halls, barefoot on the polished wood, running his hand across the staircase he had once only dreamed on paper. The house felt alive, and though it belonged to another family, he had felt something of himself dwelling there too. But he never boasted, not once. He never clipped the newspaper articles and framed them, never spoke of the praise his work had earned. Pride, to him, was not in being seen, but in building something that endured. So he let the world speak while he kept silent, folding his accomplishments into the quiet drawer of his life, the same drawer his daughter would never think to open. And now, after years of silence, after being dismissed at his own table as a man with no taste, he realized how cruel that humility had been to himself. For the house she now worshipped, the glossy photograph she pressed against her friend's hands, the dream she declared would define her future, was not a stranger's creation. It was his. Every line she admired, every arch she longed for, every corner she described with awe, had once been born beneath his tired fingers in the solitude of another life. He felt the irony wrap around him like fire and ice. She had mocked the man, yet adored the masterpiece. She had erased the father, yet idolized the vision he left behind. And though he said nothing, though he swallowed the ache in silence, he understood at last that truth has a way of surviving even the cruelty of forgetting. The house stood tall, not just in the city but in his story, unshaken by neglect, undimmed by time. It was proof that he had not lived in vain, that his name, though hidden now, had once carried weight. For the first time in years he allowed himself to feel it, not pride swollen with vanity, but pride tempered by justice. The house was still there, his work was still standing, and no careless remark, no cruel laughter could ever erase the stone and wood that bore witness to the man he once was. Weeks later, she laid the magazines across the table with the pride of someone unveiling treasure. Her eyes glowed. Her voice rang with certainty as she declared, "This house, it's everything I dreamed of." She spoke as though she had discovered beauty itself, as though her choice had set her apart from the ordinary, her tone laced with triumph. Friends leaned closer, their fingers brushing over the glossy pages, nodding and murmuring admiration. The photographs shone under the light, sweeping glass walls, a staircase spiraling upward like poetry, a roofline that seemed to stretch toward the horizon itself. She called it perfection. She called it art. She called it the very definition of taste. And he sat there, silent, watching. The magazine pages reflected the glow of the lamps, but in his mind he saw more than the photograph. He saw the nights spent hunched over a drafting board, the whispers of graphite against paper, the revisions that tore through the hours until dawn. He saw his younger self carrying stacks of sketches through offices, convincing investors, adjusting angles by a single degree until the building breathed exactly as he intended. He saw the first time light poured into the finished halls, illuminating a design that had once lived only in his mind. Now his daughter looked at it as though it were a divine revelation, blind to the fact that its breath had once been his own. Her laughter rang as she pointed to details she adored. "Look at this staircase, it's so elegant." He had carved that elegance out of exhaustion. "And those wide windows, it feels so open, so alive." He had designed them to catch the sun, to bring morning warmth into every corner. She spoke as though she had found it, claimed it, chosen it. Yet every detail she praised was his hand, his vision, his past. The sting was sharp. Not because she loved the house, but because she loved it while mocking the man who created it. She could admire the masterpiece, yet dismiss the maker. She could praise the lines, yet laugh at the hand that had drawn them. For her, the architect was nameless, faceless, just another designer she believed existed in some distant realm of genius she could admire from afar. She never once turned to him, never once asked if he knew it, never once imagined that the father she dismissed as tasteless could have shaped the very dream she now adored. He felt the ache swell within him, a mix of sorrow and justice unspoken. She had chosen his house without knowing it. She had crowned as perfection the very thing she claimed he could never understand. It was as if fate itself had turned her cruel words against her, quietly, patiently. without his need to speak. And so he sat in silence, carrying the weight of a secret she could not yet see, a truth so close it breathed through the pages she held in her hands. He froze, his breath caught in his chest, as though time itself had stopped. The magazine page glistened beneath the lamp, but he no longer saw ink and paper. He saw a memory alive before him. That roofline, those windows, that staircase winding upward like a quiet hymn, he knew them better than his own reflection. Every angle, every curve, every detail was carved into his soul from nights when he refused to sleep until the lines whispered their approval. She had chosen his design, not just a style that resembled his work, not an echo or a coincidence, but the very house that had once been his life's proudest creation. His heart pounded, as though trying to break free from years of silence. The edges of the magazine blurred in his vision, replaced by the image of his younger hands smudged with graphite, sketching those lines under the dim glow of a desk lamp. He remembered the struggle to convince doubters that warmth and modernity could live together, that steel could hold light like water, that a home could be both fortress and embrace. He remembered the first family who stepped across its threshold, their awe, their gratitude, the way they called it not just a house, but a dream made real. And now his daughter, his own flesh, his blood who had dismissed him as tasteless, had chosen it as her future crown. He did not speak. He could not. If he opened his mouth, he feared the tide of memory and pain and vindication would flood uncontrollably. Instead, he stared, silently, as her hands stroked the photograph like it was something sacred. She described its grace with glowing eyes, never realizing she was repeating words that had once been written in newspapers praising him. She marveled at the brilliance of a nameless architect, never knowing that the nameless man sat at her own table, enduring her scorn in silence. The ache inside him grew heavy, pressing against his ribs, but it was not only sorrow, it was justice, quiet and merciless. Fate had delivered this moment with cruel precision. The daughter who called him tasteless had unknowingly crowned his taste as perfection. The child who erased his worth had built her dream on the very lines of his hand. She could laugh at him, but she could not laugh away the truth written in brick and glass. The house itself stood as his witness, tall and unshakable, whispering his name in the silence where she heard nothing. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him, a quiet strength, not of pride but of recognition. His blood had been dismissed, but his work endured. His voice had been mocked, but his design spoke louder than her arrogance. And one day, when the truth unveiled itself, she would see not a tasteless old man at her table, but the architect of her own dream, the father whose legacy she had mocked without knowing she was living inside its shadow. He said nothing. His lips did not tremble. His hands did not rise. His eyes did not betray the storm gathering behind them. He let her dream aloud, let her gush in pride, let her point at the staircase he had drawn 100 times until dawn blurred his vision. Let her marvel at the windows he had angled so precisely to catch the morning light. Every word she spoke was a mirror of his own sleepless nights, and yet she believed herself to be praising a stranger. He did not correct her. He let the tide roll on, his silence vast and unmovable. Around the table, her friends leaned closer, nodding, adding their admiration, feeding her glow. She beamed, her voice rising as she spoke of elegance, brilliance, perfection. He listened quietly, hearing in her words both the knife of dismissal and the echo of vindication. She had declared him tasteless, and yet here she was, worshipping the very lines of his hand, blind to the irony that wrapped around her like a shroud she could not see. Inside, however, his heart raged. It was not anger at her ignorance. He had endured that all his life. It was the storm of memory crashing into the present. He could see himself again, younger, shoulders tense, head bent over paper, sweat staining the edges of sketches. He remembered the arguments with builders who told him his vision was impossible, the battles with investors who doubted him, the triumph of seeing it rise brick by brick against the sky. Every detail she adored had cost him a piece of his life, and now she spoke of it as though it were hers to claim, a dream she had discovered on the glossy page of a magazine. His silence grew heavier than words could bear. It pressed against the room, though no one noticed. To them he was invisible, a father too quiet, too modest to join the excitement of the future. But his silence was not weakness. It was thunder gathering behind the clouds, a storm waiting for the moment when truth would split the air and leave no room for laughter. He sat back, folding his hands, watching her eyes shine with the pride of illusion. Let her have this moment, he thought. Let her claim brilliance without knowing its source. Because truth has a way of arriving uninvited, like lightning in the night sky, sudden, undeniable, and impossible to look away from. And when that moment came, when the storm finally broke, she would see that the man she mocked as tasteless had carved beauty that even her dreams could not escape. At the architect's office, sunlight poured through tall windows, glinting across polished tables stacked with models and blueprints. She walked in with the confidence of someone about to claim a prize, gesturing at the glossy folder in her hands. "This," she said to the assistant, "this is the house I want." She barely glanced at him as he followed her inside, carrying her coat like a silent shadow. To the receptionist, she added casually, "Oh, and this is just my dad. He likes to tag along." The words cut sharper than she intended, dismissing him before strangers as if his presence were nothing more than an afterthought. He smiled faintly, as he always did, and lowered his gaze, accepting invisibility once again. But then the architect stepped into the room, a man seasoned, his hands still smudged with graphite, his eyes alive with the hunger of creation. He reached for the folder, ready to hear another client speak of tastes and desires, when suddenly his glance flicked upward, his eyes widened. He froze, studying the old man standing quietly in the corner. In an instant, recognition broke through like a flash of lightning. The architect set the folder down, rose slowly to his feet, and with reverence in his voice said, "Sir, it's an honor. You designed this." The silence that followed was absolute. Her smile faltered, her voice caught in her throat. She turned toward her father, confusion twisting her face as though she hadn't heard correctly. But the architect didn't waver. He stepped closer, extending his hand with both respect and awe. "I studied your work," he continued. "That house, it's a masterpiece. I never thought I'd meet the man who drew it." The words rang through the room like a verdict, each syllable striking against the arrogance that had once belittled him. He did not move, not at first. He only looked at the man before him, feeling the years peel back, feeling the echo of nights bent over sketches, and the weight of sacrifices that had nearly buried this part of his life. And now, here it was, pulled from silence into light by someone who still remembered, someone who had not forgotten the lines he had given the world. His daughter's face drained of color. Every insult she had flung at him rose like smoke around her, suffocating her as she stood in the truth she could not deny. She had mocked his taste, erased his worth, laughed at his silence, and yet the very house she had crowned as perfection carried his name, his vision, his soul. Her pride crumbled before her eyes, and shame pressed hard against her chest. She looked at him, at the man she thought she had already measured and dismissed, and for the first time She could not recognize the limits she had drawn around him. He accepted the architect's handshake with steady calm, his silence heavier than applause. There was no need for boasting, no hunger for revenge. The truth had spoken for him, and in that truth, the storm he had carried so long finally broke, not with thunder, not with rage, but with a quiet dignity that silenced the room. The words fell like a hammer, echoing louder than any shout could have. For a moment she stood frozen, as if the ground itself had slipped away beneath her feet, her face drained of color, the glow of triumph extinguished, leaving only the stark, raw light of humiliation. She looked at him, not as the shadow she had dismissed, not as the quiet old man she thought she knew, but as a stranger who now towered above her, cloaked not in arrogance but in undeniable truth. The father she had mocked, the man she had reduced to nothing, was the very hand behind her dream, the architect of the beauty she had worshipped with blind devotion. Her mind raced back through every moment she had laughed at him, every time she waved away his advice, every sentence she had sharpened with cruelty. They replayed in her memory like shards of glass, cutting deeper with each second. "Dad, you have no taste." The words reverberated now with a different weight, not triumphant but shameful, a condemnation of her own blindness. In front of strangers she had flaunted her pride, dismissing him with a smile that now burned like poison on her lips. Her friends shifted uncomfortably, their glances darting between her pale face and the man who stood in silence. They had laughed with her once, nodding at her arrogance, but now they saw what she had refused to see. The truth was not whispered anymore. It stood in the open, undeniable, undeniable as the walls and windows he had drawn into existence. Their silence pressed against her like a judgment she could not escape. She wanted to speak, to apologize, to erase the years of disdain with a single breath. But the words choked in her throat. Pride, once her weapon, now became her chain. Her lips trembled, but nothing came out. She could only lower her eyes, unable to bear the weight of his calm presence. For he did not gloat, did not strike her with the vengeance she half expected. He simply stood there, quiet, dignified, as if her cruelty had never had the power to diminish him. And in that silence, her collapse deepened. Shame does not shout. It whispers. It tightens. It suffocates. She felt it coil around her, pressing against her chest, forcing her to face the truth she had buried beneath her pride. The man she had erased was not erased at all. He was greater than she had ever dared to imagine. And now she could not escape the knowledge that her own blindness had been her greatest betrayal. He did not gloat. He did not scold. He did not let anger soil the moment that had waited years in silence to arrive. Instead, he breathed slowly, steady as stone, and let the truth itself do the speaking. His hand, worn with age, reached into his coat and pulled out the old sketchbook he had carried with him for decades, its cover faded, its pages softened by time. He laid it gently on the table, as if placing down a part of his own heart, and the room seemed to fall even quieter. With calm dignity, he opened it to a page where lines still whispered of sleepless nights, of vision translated into form, and slid it forward. His voice was low, but it carried more weight than thunder. "I drew this once. I never thought my daughter would choose it." The architect leaned forward, his eyes shining with reverence as he traced the page with careful fingers, confirming with awe what he already knew. But the daughter could not lift her gaze. The sketchbook was no longer just paper. It was a mirror reflecting back her arrogance, her blindness, her betrayal. Every line her father had once drawn now stood as proof that her insults had been lies, not about him, but about her own ignorance. She had called him tasteless, But the world had already tasted his vision and called it timeless. She had erased him with her laughter, but his legacy had endured without her, waiting only for the moment to rise again. He smiled faintly, not with victory, but with the peace of a man whose dignity needed no defense. There was no anger in him, no sharpness in his tone. The storm that had raged inside his chest for so long settled into calm waters. He needed no revenge, no shouting, no grand declaration. The proof lay in the lines. In the house that stood tall, in the respect etched into the architect's eyes, justice had come without fury, carried not by vengeance, but by truth revealed in silence. His daughter felt the weight press harder than any scolding could have done. His restraint, his refusal to wound her back, crushed her pride far more than anger ever could. She wanted him to rage, to explode, to match her cruelty with equal fire. But instead he stood there, dignified, unshaken, greater than she had ever allowed herself to see. In that stillness the truth was undeniable. He had never been small. It was her vision of him that had been small, and it collapsed now in the face of the man who needed no words to stand taller than them all. Her lips trembled as she tried to form words, but every sound withered before it could escape. Apologies stumbled, broken and unfinished, tumbling over each other like children lost in the dark. She whispered his name once, then again, but he did not need her sorrow. He did not need her tears. The truth itself was enough, standing taller than any excuse, stronger than any regret. He remained still, his silence carrying more weight than her frantic attempts to mend what she had shattered. His dignity had never depended on her approval. Long before she had learned to speak, long before she had learned to mock, he had lived a life of creation. He had drawn visions into existence, poured his soul into structures that endured storms, decades, generations. He had sacrificed the brilliance of recognition for the quiet duty of raising her, of giving her a future even at the cost of his own. She thought him tasteless, small, irrelevant. But the world had remembered. The world had whispered his name when she was too young to listen, and it still whispered it now, in the respect of the architect standing at his side, in the solid weight of the sketchbook resting on the table. He looked at her once, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with eyes that had seen too much to waste their light on fury. She could not meet them. Shame bent her down, forced her head to bow before the very man she once dismissed as unworthy of respect. She tried again to apologize, but he remained silent, and in that silence she felt her pride unravel thread by thread. There was no need for him to speak. The walls of her dream home already spoke for him. The articles still archived in libraries spoke for him. The very truth she had unknowingly chosen with her own hands spoke for him. In that moment, she understood what dignity meant. It was not loud. It was not cruel. It did not demand or beg. It simply existed, unshakable, untouchable, beyond the reach of mockery. His dignity filled the room now, pressing into every corner, wrapping around every witness like a crown of silence heavier than gold. And she realized that while she had spent her life chasing approval, fashion, and praise, he had carried something greater all along, a worth so deep it had never needed applause to survive. Years later, the story of that home was told and retold, but not in the way his daughter once imagined. Guests did not marvel at her choice, nor speak of her taste, nor call it her achievement. Instead, their voices always carried back to the same name, the same truth, the man who had drawn its first lines long before she ever dreamed of living within its walls. They spoke of him with reverence, of the quiet architect who never sought glory, who gave his vision freely to the world, and then stepped into silence, carrying his dignity like a hidden crown. The house itself became more than walls and windows. It became a monument to a life lived in sacrifice and strength. Journalists who had once written about its warmth found new stories in its history, uncovering the sketches, the early articles, the photographs of a younger man with ink-stained hands and tired but determined eyes. His work had survived the storms of time, and now, as new families walked its corridors, they did so with the knowledge that they were stepping into a space born from his heart. The lines he had drawn had outlived scorn, outlived neglect, and now stood eternal, undeniable. For his daughter, the weight of this truth never left her. Every morning when the sun poured through the wide windows, she was reminded not of her own triumph, but of his. Every stair she climbed whispered of the nights he once labored in silence. Every curve she admired carried the imprint of the father she had mocked, the man she had erased with careless words. Shame had once crushed her, but over the years, awe grew in its place, and with it, a respect too late to give in life, but unerasable in memory. She came to understand that her house was not just a dream fulfilled. It was her father's legacy, one she had been blind to until the truth revealed itself with devastating clarity. And for the world, his story became a lesson passed quietly from voice to voice. That greatness does not always roar, that true worth does not vanish when overlooked, that dignity held in silence often outlives the noise of arrogance. His name was no longer dismissed, no longer hidden. It lived on, not in the bitterness of anger, not in the fire of revenge, but in the design itself, a testament carved into wood and stone, a truth carried by walls that still stood tall. His name was undeniable, unerasable. When they remembered him, they did not recall the insults that once tried to bury him. They remembered the man who bore them with silence, who stood calm when the world mocked, and who allowed justice to arrive not by fury but by truth. They remembered the father whose legacy had risen higher than pride, whose vision endured long after his voice had grown quiet. And in that remembrance, his life became what it always had been, more than a story of pain, more than a tale of sacrifice. It became a legacy eternal, a name spoken not in passing, but in reverence, forever tied to the beauty he once imagined and gave to the world.